Landmark court cases, conflict and compromise. Let's review for just a minute the separation of powers that exists in the federal government. We've got the legislative branch represented by Congress, whose job it is to make the laws, the executive branch represented by the president, whose job is to carry out the laws, and the judicial branch headed by the Supreme Court, whose job is to interpret the laws. Now, sometimes these branches or people come into conflict over these responsibilities. People will object to the passage of a law and hope that the law is unconstitutional because they don't like it. Sometimes people disagree about what the law actually means, and sometimes people disagree about how a law should be enforced. When these types of conflict arise, who settles the conflict? This is where the power of judicial review comes in, and that's the idea that the actions of the executive and legislative branches of government are subject to review and possible invalidation. That means they can be declared unconstitutional by the judicial branch. Judicial review allows the Supreme Court to be active in ensuring that the other branches of government are following the Constitution. Certain Supreme Court cases are known as landmark cases. So let's talk about the meaning of this word, landmark. A landmark can be an object that serves as a guide to show you the way. For example, if I was giving you directions to my house and I said, turn right at the big red barn, the barn is a landmark. Or maybe it's a place or building that has cultural or historical significance. If you look at the picture on the right, you see the Space Needle located in downtown Seattle. The Space Needle is a landmark. However, in this case, landmark means a significant historical event or decision. There are certain Supreme Court decisions that have a lot of importance beyond just the facts of the case. One such case is Marbury versus Madison. William Marbury, pictured on the right, was a Federalist. That was one of the two political parties that existed early on in the United States. Marbury was a Federalist who was appointed by President John Adams to be a Justice of the Peace in the District of Columbia. Now, President Adams made about 58 of these so-called midnight appointments just before he left office in 1801. He had lost the election in 1800, he is leaving office, and he's appointing a bunch of Federalists to judgeships before he leaves. 17 of these appointments, including Mr. Marbury's, did not get delivered before Adams and his Secretary of State, John Marshall, left office. Without the official paperwork, Marbury and the other 16 people could not take office. They couldn't literally take the job because they didn't have the papers that made it official. So Mr. Marbury is upset. He's been appointed and he can't get his job now. James Madison was the Secretary of State of the incoming Republican President Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson ordered his Secretary of State, James Madison, not to deliver these appointments. So Marbury and these other 16 people aren't going to get their jobs because the president refuses to allow his Secretary of State to deliver the paperwork. When that happens and Marbury fails to receive the papers he needs to take office, he sued James Madison and he petitioned the Supreme Court to order James Madison to deliver his papers because that's what the law passed by Congress, the Judiciary Act of 1789, said could happen. Now, interestingly enough, the new Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Marshall, the same John Marshall who didn't get all the paperwork delivered before he left office as Secretary of State. Now, why does this case matter? It is really the first landmark court case in United States history, and it establishes the power of judicial review, or the right of the Supreme Court to review a law and decide if it's constitutional. So the question for you now is this: should the Supreme Court order James Madison to deliver the paperwork and allow William Marbury to take office? I want you to pause the video. In fact, you may need to even run it back, look at the facts of the case again. What's Mr. Marbury's side of the argument? What's Mr. Madison's side of the argument? And you decide what should happen. When you've recorded that information in your notes, resume the video and see the last bit of information. How does this case end? Well, the Supreme Court ruled that William Marbury was entitled to his paperwork and should be allowed to take his job. However, it also ruled that the Supreme Court, did not have the power to issue that kind of order that would force James Madison to deliver the paperwork. So they agree that Mr. Marbury should get his job, but basically say to him, we can't help you. Here's how they decided that. The justices decided that the law that allowed William Marbury to ask the Supreme Court to hear the case was unconstitutional. They said that the Judiciary Act of 1789 was unconstitutional because it gave the Supreme Court power to hear certain cases that the Constitution did not. So what they're basically saying is they don't have jurisdiction to decide this case. If the case had started in a lower court, like the Constitution said, and it had come to the Supreme Court on appeal, they could make James Madison give William Marbury his job. But because the case started with them, and that's a violation of their constitutional power, William Marbury does not get his job, but the Supreme Court, in the long run, gains the power of judicial review or to interpret laws and decide if they're constitutional or not. Make sure that you finished your guided notes. If you have any questions, rewind, rewatch any part of this video. Bring your notes with you to class tomorrow. Thanks for listening.